For over 10 years, I couldn't get my productions to sound how I wanted, so I buried myself in online tutorials trying to figure out why, and even having some of the same tools as other producers and mixers I envied, my productions weren't coming even close. I've heard the term referencing get thrown around, and I thought I was referencing the right way myself, but I was totally wrong, and over time developed a referencing system that would help me produce any desired result. I'm excited to announce that you can now use this same system yourself in our new course, The Magical Guide to Referencing. This gives you the exact framework I've used and successfully taught hundreds of students through the years. If you're ready to stop chasing your mixing tail in circles and ready to understand any mix you hear to replicate those same results for yourself, you can find a link to the Magical Guide to Referencing in the description wherever you're listening. See you there, my friends. Hello and welcome to Working in Music Sucks. My name is John Maciel, and for almost 2 decades I've been working in the audio recording industry. I've worked with producers and mixers like Bo Rochelle, Joey Sturgis, and Josh Newell, and countless others on records with bands like Era, Census Fell, and Moose Blood. And along this journey, I've also worked with 2 of the biggest music educational companies where I helped thousands of aspiring engineers achieve their dreams of making music production a fulfilling full-time career. But as great as that sounds, to be honest, the first 10 years of working in music sucked. I started this podcast to talk about what sucks about working in music so others like myself who love music production and want to wake up every morning fulfilled and driven to making records people love can do just that. Working in music sucks, but with what we talk about on this podcast, it doesn't have to any longer. If that sounds like your cup of coffee, then you're in the right place, my friends. Let's get into it.
Welcome back, everyone, to the show. And today's episode, I want to discuss something that will hopefully help based on another podcast that I had done on why your rates are essentially keeping you poor. In this episode, I wanted to break down kind of mathematically how to think about budgeting your services, not just as a creative, but more specifically a producer or mixer. And especially if you're trying to go from, let's say you have a 9-to-5 job right now, and you really want to, step into the world of audio production full time. And you hear from so many other producers of save up 6 months to 9 months worth of expenses, yada, yada, yada. And then when you ask the question of how much should I charge? It's always a very subjective, it depends type conversation, which sucks because so many of us want to know the answer. How much should we charge? So there's different ways of breaking this down. And the first way is you need to first find your minimum threshold. How much can you charge minimally to live, basically? And so many people get this part wrong when they're taking their first steps into starting audio. I know I did. And it took me a long while to figure the math out. So hopefully after this episode, you'll walk away feeling more confident about how you're going to survive, afford your living, but also have a roadmap on how to create rates that will give you a sustainable way of living. Because like I said in the previous episode, so many people get into this industry and they start basically charging themselves into poverty. And, it's really sad to see some people who are really, really talented, but are so bad at the business side of doing this as a business. We are in a service-based industry, and just like if we were plumber, electricians, painters, roofers, people who design homes, architects, there's so many service-based jobs, and all those roles are compensated at a degree to, essentially afford people a way to live. But when it comes to audio and a lot of creative other fields, people don't think that way. They're just like, oh, that person is, it's like a hobby that they're getting paid for, when really this is what our livelihood depends on. So changing these ways of thinking will hopefully help you to figure out how to budget. So I drew out some arbitrary numbers to just kind of give you an idea of how to think this stuff through. Now, these numbers are not my numbers. They're probably not going to be your numbers, but it's going to give you a baseline on how to do this math for yourself. That's the whole purpose of this episode, is for you to calculate what is the minimum charge you should be charging, and then how do we talk about those other things I mentioned later on in terms of how much should you charge people. Because first we need to figure out what is our minimum threshold. Like anything in life, what is your minimum threshold for sit-ups, push-ups, doing reps, exercising? How long can you sit there and mix for? How long in a day do you have the stamina to record a band? How much patience do you have with family members? Things like that. There's always a minimum baseline in everything we do in life. And having that minimum baseline is going to help you. So let's say your monthly expenses are $3,500, right? And we're talking USD because I'm in America. So anyone overseas, however you want to calculate that, but always do this math with a very even number so it's much easier for you. So your monthly expenses are like $3,500, right? And when you divide that by 4 weeks, you get $875 per week. Now, we're going to say 5 working business days. Now, I know with a little asterisk sign, when you're doing audio as a full-time career, it's not always 5 days a week, but we're going to say it's 5 days a week in this example. It's going to be, we divide the 875 by the 5 days a week, and that means we get $175 $175 for those 5 days that we work. And then we take that number and we're going to divide it by an 8-hour workday. And the reason I want to do by an 8-hour workday is because some jobs are going to require an hourly minimum that you need to consider, right? And a lot of people get fixated on the how much I want to make a month, but then they're working 6 days a week, 7 days a week, and then they're working 10 to 14 hours in the studio. Like they're tracking the bands themselves, they're doing all the editing, they're doing all the cleanup, they're doing all the mixing, all the mastering. Like you're a one-man shop or a one-person shop. And when you're only thinking in terms of like monthly expense, you're not really giving yourself the full credit because all you're thinking about now is how you're taking on all these projects just thinking about the lump sum of $3,500. You're not taking into account your time, giving yourself days off, mental rest days, because working in music is such a mental game. Like you're always thinking. It's never just shut off my brain. It's always when you're recording, you're always listening to every track. Do you hear pops? Are the cables sounding weird? Is the snare drum still in tune? Is the vocalist starting to lose it after this first verse? And now we go into the second verse and the tonality has changed within the last 3 minutes and we don't know how. So now we don't have a consistent vocal performance. And your ear is constantly listening to this and your brain's constantly thinking about this if you're recording. When it comes to mixing, you're constantly problem solving, right? Like you mix prep and then you come back in. So you have to take all of this account. Just don't think about the whole number. So many people give advice on, well, figure out how much you need a month to live and then go off of that. That's not good enough. That's not good enough. There is no way that you can go from wanting to make audio full time and have a full time job and then just think about a whole number. You're going to exhaust yourself and burn yourself out. So that's why we're breaking it down this way. So now we're at $175 for 8 hours of work, which roughly comes up to $21 an hour. So now you ask yourself, all right, you're at $21 an hour. Maybe you make a little bit less than that right now. I don't know. Maybe you make more. But now all of a sudden you're like, oh, I need $3,500 to live. If I break this down, I need to make $21 an hour. I'm either one, you could be making more, so you're excited, or two, you're making less and you're like, oh, fuck, like that is not how much I want to be making. Like I make $45 an hour. Why would I go do music? Now here's the part that's really going to suck and hurt. We're talking gross, meaning taxes have not been accounted for. So if you're thinking $3,500 and you're doing this as a solopreneur, you're not being paid like at a company. They deduct taxes and all that stuff for you. All your health insurance is maybe underneath there. All that retirement, all that stuff is wrapped up with your employer, right? So you're taking home $3,500, but how much you're earning is much more. But the taxes come in, the Medicare, the Social Security, the retirement, and that all gets deducted. So then when you start thinking about it, you're like, oh shit, $3,500, that's after all the taxes. But if you're only calculating based on what people's advice generally is, oh, I only need $3,500. Well, now you're responsible for your taxes. So 25% of that minimum is gone. Now you're responsible for your retirement. Oh shit, another, depending on how you can put it away, 10 to 30% is gone. So you see how that number gets less and less. And by the end of it, you might be at $10 an hour. And you might be working more days based on the one whole number because you're bringing on these projects that require so much more of your time. So my general rule of thumb And this took me a long time to figure out because I went through this too. And I was like, how the hell am I supposed to live? And I was mad at myself for not taking into account taxes and all the other stuff that I'm talking about, and life expenses, car expenses, like building the savings on top of all that. I never took all of that into account. So my general rule of thumb to make this all work is to take your base number and double it. So if your base number is $21 an hour, based on these simple mathematics, let's just double that number. 42. I like big round numbers. So you need to be making $50 an hour minimum. That $50 an hour is going to allow you to take the cut in taxes, have a little bit buffer for retirement, have a little buffer for anything else you need to pay for. So now you're thinking, okay, I need to make a minimum of $50 an hour during an 8-hour recording day or session. Now you know what your minimum value is, right? And this is really important because now you know how to base yourself. Now comes the time where you analyze, okay, how long does it take me to prepare a song? How long does it take me to mix the song, master? How long does it take me to record a band if the band is, a mediocre level? How long does it take me to usually tune vocals? You want to start timing yourself. See how long it takes you when you're in the zone working to do these things. And that way, like, okay, this project will take 2 hours for me to edit. So you want to say $100, right? Nope. Minimum base is $100. But once you put in more time, your skill level is worth more, because that whoever you're doing edits for, if it's yourself, if you're being hired by someone else to do those edits, your rate changes based on your experience level, and if people are going to have to read your edits, if there's going to be any notes, all this stuff takes into account too. So your minimum is 100, but the value you bring to a project and your expertise and your knowledge base brings that price up. Now, I'm not too concerned about marketplace. A lot of people say, well, what are people around you charging? I personally don't think that's a factor at all once you've developed your skills. Now, if you're first starting out, that will be a factor until your skills develop. But for most people, if you're at this stage and you're wanting to make this leap into full-time, you've probably put in some time and effort to get your skill to a certain level so that you understand you're competing with other people around you. So that point in time, I like double numbers. And if this project is going to take you 2 hours, your minimum hourly rate is 50. So now you're at 100. What's my general rule of thumb? Double it, minimum. So now you're looking at 200. Let the market tell you. Let people say, oh, that's way more outside my budget. So now you ask them, okay, what budget were you looking at? Oh, we were looking at 150. That's fine. I will do it at 150 for this project. The next project, my normal rate will be 200. Now, not only have you made your minimum, but now you've made 50 on top of that. Do you see how the math is working with this? I'm assuming you have the skills, but we're doubling whatever the minimum is. That way you don't cheap yourself out. For all you know, they could have been willing to spend 300. Now it's up to you to decide how high you want to go with that number. But I will say for most, like, for example, bass edits and things like that, depending on the skill, you can charge $200 to $300 for editing like drums for a couple of tracks. That's completely norm based on the skill level. If you have credits, things of that nature, the bands you worked with, it's because people are paying for your expertise and knowing that when they send you a file, it's going to come back how it's supposed to be. And there's not going to be any notes, any recalls. So your value is more than maybe somebody else who, yeah, they'll do it for $50, but that person's going to have to re-edit those edits. They're going to be frustrated. But you're not going to be that way, because not only are you a professional, but you're going to also know how it is because you're trying to build your own business just like that person. And or when people come to you, they trust that they know they're going to get a certain level of service. So if you're recording bands, they don't even think about how much your rate is because they know the quality of work that you're going to be outputting is totally worth what you're asking. And it's fair. So many engineers don't take this into account. And the reason you want to double this stuff is because, one, you want to keep adding to that savings. Emergencies happen. Life happens. It sucks. But you've got to be thinking gear, if you're not negotiating for gear in some of your projects, you're going to want to upgrade, incremental upgrades. It's unfortunate, but people do care about gear once you start charging a certain price. So if you have, if you're charging like $500 a day to record vocals or something like a studio would, you need to have studio quality gear. People need to walk in and be like, oh, I see why it costs $500 or $1,000 a day in the studio or something like that. It's because you have the gear. If you don't, then it's like people will be like, I'm paying a lot. And yeah, there's a certain number you can charge based on the scale, but people want to take those. They want to take those Instagram photos. They want to make those TikToks or the short form content. They want to repost. They want to brag. And if you're not creating an environment that allows them to brag, they're gonna kind of question what their money's going to, even though your skill set does allow for it. It's a different way to think about it. But also taxes, retirement. You are your own retirement plan, right? So figure out your base number. Figure out how much you can take minimum per hour, double it. Make it whole. This was just one example. And then if you realize your minimum is more than you thought and it makes you a little scared, that's okay. But now you know your minimum baseline of what you can afford, and then you start rethinking what kind of projects. So this whole conversation, this whole episode, you're probably thinking bands the whole time. You're like, oh man, how am I going to get bands to agree to this? Yes, bands are important, but there's so many other ways to make money in audio besides recording bands. There's editing podcasts. There's editing audio for video. There is recording audio for like infomercials and voiceovers and things of that nature. Just think, what are things that require audio? And maybe you want to think about diversifying your portfolio and going to figure out, okay, where are some studios where I can record stuff to help, bring in that baseline number so that you can afford to take on those projects that maybe don't meet your baseline, but they're passion projects and you feel like they're good for your resume. Because the last thing also that I want to leave you with to think about that I had to really consider quite a few times is, let's say you have your baseline, but you meet an artist or someone who they're tight on funds and they can't afford to pay your baseline. Maybe they can do the actual half. So in this example, we'll go back to the $21 an hour. Maybe they can only afford you for that $175 a day rate for 8 hours worth of work. And it's a little, that is technically your minimum, but you're still going to have to pay taxes on it. So it's like, but this artist is really, really good. And you really feel good that if you do this record, it's going to look great on your resume. It's not necessarily if this artist takes off, it's going to be great for me. It's people will hear this thing that I did and word of mouth will carry on. And then I will get work from that word of mouth. And sometimes you do have to really think about these type of projects. Not everything always comes down to the baseline of every artist needs to pay this amount. There are going to be some outliers, some artists that you're really going to have. This is a quote, an answer only you can have. No one can tell you, hey, you should do this band. You have to decide for yourself, is it worth it? And that's where you really have to put yourself in a business chair, and like, not every band can be a passion project. For every 10 bands you record, I truly believe that, 8 of them should be bands that can pay your rate. And then you have the 2 that don't really have to, because you have these other ones that paid your rate, if not more. And you're okay to take on these 2 other passion projects. But your baseline, your hourly, your daily, how much you need to bring in so you can afford to pay for all the other junk in your life. So hopefully you found this episode helpful. Don't go charging yourself into poverty. It's not worth it. You'll end up being so resentful of this field that's super fun. And if you live in an area where you're like, well, yeah, John, the sounds great, but I don't think people around me are going to want to pay it. Well, maybe not to record, but there's this thing called the internet where you can go and find people who are from all over the world that will pay your rate. And I will say one thing about personal life experience between myself and many friends who are also in this field. When you start working online, it's very important to stay true to your rate as much as possible, just like if you're in any other scenario. And what I've come to notice, and what has happened to me and many friends, is that the artists that you work with at a discount always end up being transactional type relationships where they come back once, maybe twice, but the second time's an even worse experience. But the ones who pay your rate or more without question, without hesitation, end up being some of the best projects you work on because they're so easy and very seamless. But they end up being people who tend to refer you out to their friends and other people who are interested in doing audio or recording their own project or something. So something to keep in mind too, based on how you select your projects. So hopefully you found this episode helpful. Wherever you're listening, if you'd like to continue this discussion or talk, there's a link to the Plugin Alley Discord below. And I'll see you in the net. Until then, remember, working in music sucks, but with what we talked about in this episode today, it doesn't have to. Until next time, friends.